Hey everybody, welcome back to a new episode of your favorite Vue podcast. You might just not know it yet, and it's DejaVue. Yes, and you might wonder, hey, new intro, what's up? Maybe you wonder, hey, where's Michael as a co-host? Yes, he's not there this episode. He'll come back in the next one, so no worries. But luckily, I am not alone here in this episode. Would be interesting though, but even better, we have some really amazing things to talk about with our guest this time. First episode with her on DejaVue. Give a warm welcome to her. She's a DX engineer at Prismic. She is a public speaker as well, and also a Nuxt.js core team member. Hey, Lucie, how are you doing?
Hey, Alex, how are you doing? I'm great, doing great, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm good too. I'm very happy that you joined the podcast today. I'm looking forward to all the amazing topics. So, yeah, what's on your mind? What happened recently? Any news you want to share? Anything like, hey, that's so cool that happened?
Oh, well, like right now, like these days, I'm working on like courses. So like at Prismic, my company. So we'll talk about that. But yeah, like I got to work on like Nuxt courses, and like we're like released like a small courses for Nuxt 3 and Nuxt UI recently.
Yes.
But also like preparing our like to release like a first course for Nuxt 4 as soon as it's out, because like that's the hot topic right now in Nuxt.
Of course. Yeah, and they're all like, they're free, they're available on YouTube, and the link for this is also, of course, in the description. So if you want to check them out, definitely worth a watch. I also checked them out. So yeah, that's really cool. So glad to see you also doing some content creation on that. And how do you like that? How do you like creating these courses? Not just like a short video, it's the actual series. So yeah, what do you think about it?
Well, it's really interesting because like when you like it really like gets you back to the basic. Like yeah, like I want to build like a website like for people like to bring like all they earned and like bring them like to a full website like from zero to something. It's like it's really interesting like to get back to this process. Things yeah, like I'm new to Prismic, I'm new to Nuxt, I'm new to Nuxt UI, and I want to like learn all of that, like get a bit of hang of everything, get from zero to something that is like hosted, and from here like have the perspective I need to be able like to build my own stuff for real later on. So it's quite a journey. It's a lot of work also every time, because like when you do like 1 hour long course, like a 2 hour long course, like it's a lot of things to plan, a lot of things that you want to be as smooth as possible. So like you don't want like to ramble too much, or like yeah, like oh, I'm using Tailwind. Tailwind is built on post CSS and so on and so on. Like you don't want to go too far. You just want to keep it like the right level. So like people like still are still able like to follow along and like hopefully like learn a few things along the way and like that enable them.
That totally makes sense. And yeah, I mean, I also know it myself. If it, like the deeper you go, you can't like explain everything from zero. You have like people have to have at least some like level of knowledge. Be like, okay, I know maybe what Tailwind CSS is. If not, let's check it out, build a little bit of it, and follow along. Or I mean, JavaScript knowledge, of course, as well. So what do we say? Like, what is usually the average like audience in terms of like skill level knowledge that you're aiming for with these content pieces?
What I'm aiming for mainly is like people that like have a general understanding of Nuxt. So like I'm not explaining every time like here like this is the pages directory and this is how you do routing and stuff like that. Like I expect people like to be at least somewhat familiar with that, and from here like they're able like to pick up and like yeah, like the thing we're introducing today is Nuxt UI, and so that I don't expect you to know anything about Nuxt UI. I give you like a walkthrough of what it is and give you like a glimpse at like what it enables you to do and to craft quickly with it.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's like not zero, but also not super deep into it, not like the crazy advanced cases.
Yeah, basically, if you run like some Nuxt website, like at one point, like you're good, like to go and like to pick up a course.
Sweet, but yeah, maybe we're already quite deep into the whole topic as well. Maybe like we even rewind a little bit and start with like how you even got into like using Vue.js, maybe frontend in general. So like how did that happen back in time?
So back in time, like in the old days, well, like actually like a lot of people, I noticed like I started with React, really? And I know like some also like went that route, and I started with React, and like it didn't make any sense to me because well I was like still like picking up JavaScript and everything, and like all of a sudden they were like, hey, like it lets do JSX, and then you have to know like all the array.map, array.filter and stuff like that are like still like quite advanced from someone like from point of view of someone that is still learning JavaScript. And so I was like, all right, I get the hang of it, but like this is all like super abstract to me, so let's try Vue.js. I tried Vue.js and it was like, well, you can just template in HTML, CSS, do some JavaScript if you want to. And if you want to display something conditionally, if you want like to loop over something, there's this little syntax that you just add in your tags and that gives you what you need. No like JSX, no array.map and stuff like that. So it was like much simpler for me to understand and just made more sense. And that's something I've always said about Vue.js. Like if you have no strong background in JavaScript, if you're not used to JSX and everything, like if you come like from PHP or if you've been doing like Java with like Spring Boot and like Java like templates and stuff like that, it's all HTML and CSS. So you already have like 2 out of the 3 components that make Vue.js, whereas like with React, you have this JavaScript to learn and then JSX, and like that's a lot of work for those people. So yeah, that's where I think like it just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit similar for me. Like I didn't try React first, to be fair. I spared that because Taylor Outwell back then, the creator of Laravel, was like basically tweeting about Vue, and it's like, oh, that seems easy. Let's try. And yeah, same idea. I was not like super in depth in JavaScript. Of course, I wrote some vanilla JavaScript, lots of jQuery before, but yeah, it clicked way easier than learning all the different concepts of React in terms of like JSX, and then also making lots of choices. On the other hand, if you have Angular and think about, okay, you have to learn TypeScript and then all the interesting principles like dependency injection and OOP and classes, and there's also felt like so much overhead just to build a tiny part of the application. And I think Vue is in a really sweet spot right in the middle there, where it is somewhat opinionated, making things easier, but giving enough freedom to still like express yourself and do things.
Yeah. And so from here, well, I quite quickly like pick up Nuxt because, well, it was the easiest way like, to get into Vue without like having to worry about Webpack and everything like on your own. So, well, I started with Nuxt 2. I think it was like Nuxt 2.2 or something like that, like really like early version of Nuxt 2. And well, the appeal back then was like to make like static websites. And this was quite non-trivial with Nuxt back then because, well, Nuxt was like a universal framework, meaning like it runs on the client, it runs on the server, it does a bit of both. But like having just something like full static with Nuxt was hard back then. Because like there was like this payload thing that you need like to render and like to fetch on the client when well, every time. And so like those utilities weren't introduced into Nuxt 2 until a long time. Like, I think it's like Nuxt 2.14, something like that, like when it was like the full static utilities. But until it was not possible, it was like you were a bit on your own to try to do that. It was said it was possible, it was tough. And so that's where I started like really like digging into Nuxt. I was like, well, I want to make my website with Nuxt. It's a blog, so I don't want any server involved in that. And I want it referenced because, well, it's a blog. I want my content to show up on Google. That's how I started. I came back and I was like, let's make this website static. And I was like, well, maybe I'll make this website static, but like I will make other Nuxt websites in my life. Back in that time, I was working as a freelancer. So like I also doing Nuxt websites for clients, and I wanted their website to be fast too. And so I was like, well, let's make a Nuxt module for that, which, if you don't know, Nuxt modules are like small plugins that you can add into Nuxt to add in functionalities to the whole framework, and they're really powerful. I made a talk about that, and like there's a great documentation about modules. But basically, like I created this add-on for Nuxt.js that like was doing like all the heavy lifting of handling the payload in Nuxt, like and like allowing our website to finally be fully static and not to make any query to the server on the client when hosted on like Netlify or Vercel back in the days. So yeah, I was happy with that. And this enabled me like to make my blog and also like to make other websites for also like fully static without having like to worry too much about it. And like with the setup and everything, just like drop the module and then you are pretty much done. So that was really cool. Well, that was like a first somewhat contribution of mine. And then I started like doing like other like small modules. So like I wanted like to have like a module that does like the head tag of my application manages all of that. So today, like we have an head, but back in the day, like we didn't have anything. So I wanted something like a bit like simpler to handle like the meta tags in my head of my website. And so I made another module for that and so on and so on. So I had like this little collection of modules. One of those that like gained some popularity was the Nuxt link module, which basically just was a super simple module that added just a Nuxt link component that was doing a bit more than the Nuxt link component. It was basically like handling any kind of link on your website, but was also able to support links outside of your website.
Yeah, finally. So like an anchor tag.
Yeah, it's like the anchor tag and the Nuxt link put together.
I feel like so many people wrote something like that. I remember I also wrote a little, like even a Vue plugin for that. Just like, hey, okay, there's this special link. I can't even remember how it was named. It exactly just does that, and a little bit of scrolling as well. And luckily, Nuxt 3, this is all built in, also thanks to URFC back then. So yeah, I'm happy to see that, for example, that module eventually made it into the core of Nuxt. Even like it took a major version, but it's it's there.
Yeah, well, it was non-trivial to get it working, but basically, yeah, like I had this like universal link component, and like I wrote about it. It gained some traction on like Twitter and everywhere. And like basically like Sebastian, so like one of the Nuxt founder, like reached out to me and like, well, like we really like this idea. Like, what do you think about like bringing it to Nuxt 3? And I was like, well, let's do it. That's how I made my first like main contribution to Nuxt as well, and also like paved me a bit the way like to get into the core team, like be invited in the core team by Daniel later on. But yeah, I was really happy that I was able like to make that. It was quite an accomplishment for me. Like, well, like this little link component I was using for making websites online, like now everyone's using it, so it's pretty cool.
In every Nuxt application, it's part of your code. So yeah, I know the feeling. It's so cool to just be like, hey, that part. Every website running Nuxt, like, yeah, there's a part of my work in there, and it helps keeping things running. It helps making things easier, and yeah, it's a big thing.
Well, in all fairness, it has changed quite a bit since.
Well, of course, but I mean that's also normal with code, right? Like you write it, and of course it's not meant to stay forever. If you can reduce some more by like keeping things around, sure. If you like can improve things, definitely. But also it's part of the history. Like without your contribution, Nuxtling would maybe look totally different than it does right now. And same applies to lots of other situations. So even if the code gets changed afterwards, it's still like big credits in the end.
Yeah. And well, so that's one of the main contribution that basically got me invited to the Nuxt team. I've done like also like few like were more like oriented toward like Windows compatibility, because I'm one of those working on Windows.
They still do?
Yeah, I'm still like, well, recording that on Windows right now.
To be fair, I'm also recording on Windows right now, but at least I use WSL when I'm at home and don't use my Mac.
I also use WSL now and then, but I work most of the time on plain Windows.
Interesting.
Which, well, doesn't make sense to some people, but well, when you're working with just like Node.js and like simple stuff, like it's working.
Yeah, like I mean that's the good thing. Like nowadays, lots of things just work, but I also know like Nuxt had some Windows related issues in terms of performance, for example. Also like the paths, as you mentioned, the whole like path resolution. To me, it's just and that's just one of the many packages that are in the Node module. So like, yeah. I'm very happy just setting up WSL.
Yeah, well, in all fairness, like the performance on like plain Windows are still like really crappy. So yeah, like kudos for using WSL, and I do something also.
But on the other hand, it's really good that like you use Windows, because then also you can pinpoint these issues. Even though it sounds like a very tedious thing to do, it's also important because there are way more people using Windows than people might expect. Because of course, not everybody can either buy a MacBook, or it goes like full on Linux, or like even WSL2 is not supported everywhere. Plus, it's also a bit of overhead. You need a quite okay machine to run it, and so on and so on.
Yeah, like WSL is like has its own like kind of tricky things to figure out sometimes.
Yeah. So that's also interesting. I remember like you, as you said, you wrote a couple of modules, even want to like control your Philips Hue.
Yeah.
that's always a fun one. Like I love that as an example.
Yeah, so well, I've always been into Nuxt modules because basically like they are like really simple to write, and you can do anything with them on your Nuxt application. And well, by anything, like really anything, like you can really accurate into the framework if you're into that. At your own risk, of course. And yeah, one of the challenges I set myself, to make like this Philips Hue module, is to have like a module that runs on your Nuxt application, but like any Nuxt application that you run on your machine. So like it's not installed on the Nuxt application explicitly, but it's still running. And what's beautiful, like Nuxt has like all the methods and like APIs to allow you like to do that, to run a module like on all your Nuxt application without having it installed explicitly. And that's thanks to Nuxt global configuration that you have on your computer, which is something like a bit hidden feature or sort, because like it's not like really helpful for a lot of people, but that's something you can abuse to like register modules for every Nuxt application you run locally.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I think not many people know about it. So maybe let's go a bit more deeper on that. Like how did you do it? Because it's also not that difficult.
So, well, basically to register a module in Nuxt, you add it to your Nuxt config. So, well, the easy way of doing that is just like, well, you go to your project, you go to your Nuxt config.ts file, and you add your module there. But actually, like the phrase like your Nuxt config is like just like a principle. It's on like your Nuxt config means like multiple things. First of all, like there's like the default config that Nuxt uses, which gets merged like the config that you have on your like a project, and which gets merged like another config file like the Nuxt RC that you might have on your project also. And then you have the global Nuxt RC that you have at the root of your home folder on your computer that also gets merged. And like Nuxt like smashes like all those configs like smartly together with DejaVue, I guess. And well, it creates a config out of that. And so out of all those configs, like you cannot edit like the default config because it's in the framework itself, so like it's just like set in stone. You can edit like the config of the project, but that's one is local to the project. You don't want to add like a funny module. Like it has to be like work serious, so you keep it as is. And you don't want to edit like the Nuxt RC on your project because that's also like a serious business here, so no place for funny business. So the only place like you can edit a config that is not on your project is your home configuration that is like outside of your project that doesn't get on Git and that you can do anything on it for fun at your own risk. And so, well, like to install the Nuxt module, basically when you install it, it installs it on your home Nuxt config, which is outside of your project. And this means that when you run your project, it loads the home config and like smashes it together, all the other configs, and all of a sudden you have the module that is installed globally, and that's running on all your Nuxt application. And well, so this sounds all silly, like because like, well, like yeah, cool, we have a module that is installed globally. That's also a bit scary, like because like, well, like you can run code on all Nuxt application globally,
every Nuxt application as well. Yeah,
and all of that just to like blink lights in your room. Oh, that sounds silly, but actually it's not that silly because this actually inspired how to install the Nuxt DevTools at the very beginning. And I was chatting with Anthony Fo, who was working on the DevTools, and when it started, like the DevTools was also installed like globally. So it was something you had like on your home Nuxt config, and it was like, yeah, like you have the DevTools on these machines, like on all your Nuxt projects, the DevTools is here and showing up. Well, it turns out like we changed a bit the way this works because, well, issues. But yeah, like this inspired the beginning of the DevTools. So, well, like blinking lights to like DevTools, which is now like that's really fancy thing that other framework are trying to get.
Yeah, everyone. I was also recently talking about it on another podcast. Of like, I feel like the whole other JavaScript ecosystem was a bit jealous of the like Nuxt DevTools there. But it's also so nice to see that even like some fun experiments turn out to have something that's, well, useful for everyone eventually. And also just to see, okay, this is possible, right? There might be people with very interesting business requirements, like, oh yeah, locally on all machines that should be installed, but not committed to GitHub or whatever, like to Git repository for whatever reason. So even then, that's a totally valid way to go for. And yes, it's just nice that these things work. That's like that hackable.
Yeah. So yeah. Well, Nuxt modules are some, and you can do a lot of things with them.
Yeah, and you mentioned the DevTools. Like once again, there is a discussion right now. Probably also when the podcast comes out, it's probably still up about how to enable the DevTools by default. Yes, no, shortcuts, config entry, and so on. Because ideally, you also don't want to have that like DevTools true thing in the Nuxt config, because, well, it's also one more thing. It's not too minimal and a little bit, well, there could be better solutions. So also if you in the audience, of course, Lucie, you as well, if there are any things to say there, the issue is also linked in the show notes and description. So voice your opinion there, think, okay, want to have the DevTools by default, yes, no, shortcut, like just the icon whatsoever, because that's super important.
Yeah. And so, well, I made all those silly things in Nuxt. And, well, one of the great things, like when you make silly things, like you learn things along the way, you can also turn them into talks. So, of course, I made like a talks about Nuxt global modules, which was what was the Nuxt UI module. And this was actually my very first talk ever at a conference back then. And yeah, it was interesting to see like to explain to people like, yeah, like you can see like you can like fiddle with things and figure out things, and then you can like teach them to everyone so that like more people know about it.
Yeah, especially if some lovely examples where people like can relate. It's like, hey, that's just a funny use case. Doesn't have to be always like super serious, and like a real life use case is sometimes way better than like something abstract. And at which conference did you give your very first talk? I mean, I know.
Well, it was at Next Nation back in 2020. So like during like COVID, like peak times. So there was like no real fun business like doing real life conferences back then. So yeah, so I gave my talk there, and then I gave it again in Amsterdam. Which was no, I didn't give it again in Amsterdam. I gave another talk in Amsterdam. This was also about module, if I remember correctly. And yeah, that's how I started a bit of my speaker journey, which, well, I didn't know it was something I would be into, but it was really interesting, like to prepare for all of us and to, well, like always great, like to meet people and like share things together. Yeah, well, sadly, I haven't been able like to do talk this year so far due to personal issues, but very much looking forward to get back to it at the end of the year and next year for sure.
I mean, there's still a few CFPs open here and there. Also, Julian, another fellow Nuxt core team member, who also was on here already, episode about Nuxt server components, also linked, of course. Also asked me recently, like, hey, do you know some like open conferences around the end of the year? Maybe like, oh yeah, you spoke there and there. How about that? Because it's so much fun in the end. And as you said, it's like you don't know if it's something for you until you like really tried it out. And I don't know, for me, like all these conferences, I love, like, of course, giving talks and being on stage. Every now and then also emceeing. But like just getting in touch with the people discussing the talk content, or just, chatting about Vue and Nuxt and all that is just so much fun. And also it gives like lots of insights in like how people work, what people do, what people try. So it's lovely.
Yeah, it kind of reconnects you to the community. So, and like what people are actually like up to with Nuxt and like other, well, in JavaScript and development in general. But yeah, like for the end of the year, I'm really looking forward to Vue.js Toronto. So like crossing fingers, I want my talk there.
It would be lovely. Yeah, I also submitted, of course. Well, giving it a try. Let's see.
You also submitted?
Yeah, but let's see if it will work out or not. I was there last year, and it was really, really nice. Big shout out.
Well, like all conferences they've been to like were really lovely. So like organizers are all like awesome. So
yeah, everybody's like trying their best, of course. I mean, it's also like it's not too easy to just spin up a whole conference, especially like 2-day conferences like Vue.js Amsterdam, or also the Vue.js DE conference, where we, by the way, also have a little discount code in the description called DejaVue. Yeah, just use it for 10% off, because some people will be there. Michael, sadly not this year. Maybe next year I'll be around there. Some other guests before Evan will like do a little remote Q&A and so on. And yeah, you should also submit for next year, Lucie, 100%.
Yeah, I should submit next year. I've never been to Berlin, so that's really opportunity.
Actually, it's this year. Actually, it's not in Berlin. It's in Bonn. Maybe it's in Berlin.
That works for me also.
No, like it was in Berlin before. So this is like, hey, let's switch locations, because there's so many nice cities in Germany, I heard. And I can't complain. It's closer to the Netherlands, so. It's that's good, and it will be lots of fun as usual. So yeah, conferences are really great. And I can also like just recommend everybody go out there, talk to people. Same with local meetups. I feel like that kind of like died a little bit after COVID. It's really sad that there's like lots of people not that active anymore, but maybe they're like really good just JavaScript meetups where you can talk with all the people in the JS ecosystem, or like general front end development. And even there, why not giving a talk about Vue? Because,
I don't know what killed Meetup. Like, is it the people or is it the company hosting them?
I think it's a bit of both. Like, I mean, these are all run by volunteers, right? Like, okay, in COVID, you did it all like remote, exactly. So, and then, okay, people get back to office. Now it's like hybrid, a little bit here and there. And then, of course, the budgets for companies like, hey, we hosted, let's see. Maybe some organizers also during COVID had like other responsibilities, maybe had issues as well. So, yeah, that sadly, it really shrank a bit, but I hope to see, well, that coming up again, because I went to a lot of meetups, also like not only Vue meetups, also like general ones, because it's super interesting. You meet people outside of your bubble and, well, can talk with them about all the newest things in web development and whether you should use const or let, for example. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, it's really good.
Tabs or spaces.
Oh yeah. The discussion will go on forever and ever. But yeah, I think that's also something. It's like, I've been to a couple meetups this year, for example, in Belgium, to like the BEJS and the Bellevue crossover that was around in Ghent. That was really nice. And of course, in the Netherlands, just, well, one train ride away or one bike ride if you want to. So that's really good. And go there, take a look, like chat with your fellow mates and see what's going on. By the way, when will be the next Vue.js Paris?
Well, I have no clue. I know there was like a big conference, like the TED Talk inspired conference in Paris, like in June, but like for JavaScript. Well, so unfortunately, I didn't like make the cut because like they were like they wanted like to make like a high end conference of sort. So, well, I don't like I was a bit too late to submit to that, I guess. But yeah, like I guess next year, and I don't know if there's like a Vue.js Paris going on. Like maybe that's something for to ask Eduardo about.
Yeah, definitely. I saw something on Twitter of like, hey, there will be another edition. I think this was also JavaScript in Paris, also very active. So yeah, Elise and Eduardo maintaining that, and yeah, always looking for speakers. So if you're in Paris and around, that's worth just submitting an issue in the GitHub repository and going for that. But yeah, coming back to you. So you contributed to Nuxt. You still contributing to open source. You joined the Nuxt team. So what would you say are your, let's say, responsibilities on the team? Where you're like, okay, this is something I want to look into. Is there even something that's specific?
Well, the Nuxt team is like quite like embracing like freedom. Like everyone's welcome to work on whatever they feel inspired to. So back in the day, I was working on the links, components. I was working a bit on the documentation. Then I worked a bit on the modules. So lately I've done like some like really smallish work on the module utilities, like to prepare for Nuxt 4. So I'm still like taking like special care like to Nuxt modules, well, to my own extent, because that's the part of Nuxt I'm the more like fluent with. If you bring me like to all like the Vite and like Nitro stuff, I get lost a bit quicker. But yeah, like in France, the code base is getting quite big, and like with all like the NJS and like Nitro and everything.
Lots of packages as well. Yes,
yeah,
that's true.
Lots of things like to keep up, and like all of my notifications on GitHub, and I have quite a lot.
Wow.
So.
I can't. I have like 3K or something. It's
no, I was like, well, I'm like a zero inbox type of person. So
I wish I like until I think like a month ago, I had like 3,000 unread emails. Like I read them as I will read them later. Now I'm I think down to 12 or something. So like a friend of mine pushed me there, so I'm quite happy. Yes, 3 even by now, so it's good. But there's just so many things. But with GitHub, I can't. I follow like Nuxt. I follow a few modules that I'm like. I think right now it's for me important to read the issues, to try each them. But other than that, it's like, yeah, whenever it feels like, because it's too much.
Yeah, well, of course, like there's like something like it's an issue, and like it's like someone like explaining their issue. I'm like, well, I gave like a quick walkthrough, but like I can't like answer it. Like yeah, well, actually, most of the time I can't answer. So
yeah, but I mean, it's not only about answering, right? That's the good part. It's a lot also about, hey, okay, here are some ideas you can try out, or maybe just, okay, where's the reproduction, the classic. Or like just helping with some pointers, or even saying, oh yeah, look, here we have a similar issue to track, check that out. So I mean, of course, this all helps already, because then it's less for the people who go through all these issues as well.
But yeah, so many modules, which are the things I master the most, and then I try to keep an interest in everything else to my own extent. But in all fairness, I miss a bit developing like just websites with Nuxt.js because I'm working at Prismic as a developer experience engineer, which means I work on the experience of people making websites. But I don't make websites myself that much. Well, I make my websites, of course, make like some like funny and like websites on my end also. But like I haven't been working like a real like SSR website, like e-commerce stuff like in ages.
Yeah, I mean, fair. That's not what your main job is. That's
of course. And that's why also like to get back like to the very beginning of this chat is like I'm happy like when I work on courses because I'm like, yeah, like let's work on an actual like e-commerce website. And I know it's just for a course, but at least like it gets me like exploring a bit more like things that I'm not touching every day.
It's also a bit like, hey, let's actually build something again, not just make the experience for people building stuff better. And I think it's so important to do that. Like also with Michael, we had these chats, and even Michael as well with Matt, for example, from LearnVue, about it's so nice to get some, let's say, actual project experience of like, okay, let's actually build things, dog fooding. Okay, hey, that's the framework. Oh, this could be better. Maybe I just raise an issue. Or maybe, oh, here, this like that could be directly fixed in there. Or here's missing some documentation. And of course, also just like, hey, I built something. It's there. I can show it to people. And like, hey, this is it. Because it's amazing. It's like, for all the people using, for example, Nuxt, or also in your case, like using Prismic, they have a better experience now. But to make that like quantifiable is really difficult.
Yeah, and so that's why also like on my end, like I try to allocate sometimes like serious times to like personal projects of mine, because I know that like when I'm building like things, that's when I get ideas for like contributing to open source, because like I get frustrated against like something, I get like discover an issue when using like something in that way and everything. And so those are all like opportunities and like longing fruits of some sort, and like inspire me like to try like to make things better for everyone. Because like monkey patching or like doing things like other way, like it just solves the issue for you like on one time. But if you can solve it for anyone, like that's also cool.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think a lot of contributions come from that. And I see that in issues and pull requests all the time. Of like, okay, I have an issue, and to solve that, okay, I patch it on my own. And there are some scenarios where the patch is, of course, nice for you, but not enough for like the general solution. But going that extra step and say, okay, I have that problem. I know about the problem the best right now because, well, it's mine, at least for the specific case. And then just going further saying, how can I solve it in general? Just like giving some suggestions, or even just saying, that's an issue. Here's my solution. This is why is a problem. This is how it solves it. That's already like great help, in my opinion, to just like even get people started to, oh, that's a thing. People try to use it like that. Maybe it's like, oh, you shouldn't use it like that at all. Or, oh, wait, that's a case I didn't consider. So just like making people aware of that is already a big benefit. So you already mentioned you work as a DX engineer as your main job. Also there, of course, like we all, probably all of our listeners know about that, but just to mention, of course, we're not like employed as like being part of the Nuxt core team. Like this is not something we get like I don't know, hourly rate for or something like that. Yeah, oh, it would be fun, but on the other hand, like it's so nice to see that like so many people in the core team, they have like different, let's say, sources of incomes, from like people doing open source the whole day, like Anthony, for example, Daniel, Puya as well. Also from people like you and also Julian have like a day job, and also people going like all freelance and doing open source as like, on the side, even though on the side is not exactly correct.
So yeah, well, how do I make like my open source like sustainable in some way? But well, that's a big word for like the small amount of open source I do. But anyway.
Yeah, but how do you do it? Like, how do you do open source, like, and also having a day job and also having a life besides that?
So basically, like, I'm working at Prismic as a developer experience engineer, and there I'm like the head of open source of the company. That means that like I do like open source for Prismic, which doesn't mean like I'm just like paid by Prismic to do open source. I'm paid by Prismic to do open source in the benefit of Prismic, which in the vast majority of my time is just like creating SDKs for Prismic. So like I create like a bunch of SDK for Prismic. I create the Nuxt module for Prismic, for example, and I do all of those. But like every time, for example, like, hey, like it would be nice like to integrate into that thing better, and like maybe like we can like help them like have this framework achieve their goal faster, for example. we had the case like earlier on with Astro, where like we really needed them like to provide a way to do server-side rendering like on some routes and stuff like that. And so at the beginning it wasn't possible with Astro, so like we kind of like saw like how we could like help them like achieve that goal on their roadmap like faster or like contribute to it and things like that. And yeah, I'm really happy that work for a company like values that and like sees that as like something strategic and like beneficial for everyone, like to like contribute outside of like just code base that is like purely owned by Prismic.
It's super interesting. Like in the last episode, we had Dan and Zoe from Sidebase on. They're like an agency and they do side stream. So they do, for example, the Sidebase Nuxt off package and so on. They were also talking about how open source benefits the company. And now it's really interesting to see that from a different angle, because I mean, Prismic is a product-based company, right? Like, so you have a headless CMS, so to say. And of course, then open source has a different goal in a way. Like you want it to be easier for developers to use your product. You want it to make more accessible, no matter which framework you use, of course. So it's really interesting to see that this is also a way that open source can benefit a company, in this case with a product focus, and not as much with an, let's say, agency focus.
Prismic, like as a company, like that's selfish, that wants to make money and everything. We want it to be compatible with like the technologies people use it.
Of course.
And well, like turns out like most of the technologies are like open source because, well, that's lovely actually. And that's like great. Yeah, like there's like three, like there's like the Prismic like area and there's the open source area, and like those like matches at one point. And this is all like an area of opportunities where like as Prismic, like when we work within that area, like we benefit both the community and both Prismic in the same way. And that's also like why Prismic, like when I go to conferences and I go to talk about Nuxt modules, like Prismic is like, yeah, like you can go and like don't need to put days up for that. Like we got you covered, and just spread the love of like Nuxt and Nuxt modules, and like we're happy about you doing that, and that's really cool to be working for a company that like understands that, and like it's like, yeah, like it's cool that this is like just contributes to open source, because that's also good for us as a company in a way.
100%. Also, I mean, it once also shows like, okay, you work at a company that, as I said, it values open source, it values people also going to conferences, speaking, or just attend, like quote unquote just, right, but attending, like, like broaden their horizon, learn more. And that's also something like people will see these values of a company then as well. And it's like, okay, maybe if I want to work there, or maybe even want to use the product, give it a try, it's really cool. And then if they say, okay, let's try the CMS, they say, okay, the better the integration is, the more the developers who will work with that, because they have to integrate it, they will like it, of course. They're like, hey, it's super easy. And then it's word of mouth, or it's just like, okay, it worked well once. We have a couple more projects. For example, an agency, we're like, okay, I need a headless CMS for all the content. Then it's easy to say, like, let's continue with that. It works well. Why not?
Exactly. One way, like, for example, like Prismic allows me to do that is that, well, I'm working at Prismic, that's one thing, but as we've been talking about, I'm also like a Nuxt core team member. And for example, like there's no, like it's totally understandable, like from Prismic point of view, like when we have the Nuxt core team meetings and stuff like that are playing during the workday, that I stop working for Prismic and I go to those meetings, and that's totally fine by Prismic, and like it's just like part of my regular shift, and like everyone's happy with that, and so that's really awesome.
That's really cool. And like, do you have, let's say, dedicated time to say, okay, then I work on open source and then not, or is it more like
we don't have like things like hey, like it's Friday afternoon, so like you can do open source and stuff like that. We don't have things like that. We have our projects. If they involve like open source things, we do open source. If they don't, they don't. We tried at some time to set something like like Friday afternoons for open source, but like we can't stick to it, because like I don't know like how you feel. And so to me, like open source is not something I can like sit at my desk and be like, hey, I'm gonna do open source right now. And that's not something I can do like that. Like to me, I need like to encounter issues, to be inspired by things, like to make better. And so I can't just say, yeah, like Friday afternoons for open source, because that doesn't work for me. So yeah, like we couldn't stick with that. And but yeah, like every time there's like something like that involves open source, like we're more than happy like to take some time away and like to contribute to like the community. For example, like to build our SDK, we use a lot of like small packages that you might not have heard of, but like from NJS or like from like Cylinder Resources or like Worm or like all those like being like open source agents. And well, like sometimes we're like, yeah, like this thing is like not working as expected, or like this thing has an issue, or like we think like this could be better, and like we jump in and like try to make that work for everyone. And that was the case like for NJS with like Windows issues, for example, or like other stuff.
Oh, that's amazing. Also, like giving the opportunity to contribute, of course, back, and not just like fixing it for yourself, as I mentioned before. And also not having like, I mean, Friday afternoon, yeah, as I said, it's really difficult, but sometimes people, like companies are like, okay, 20% time, of course, like you can take it quite flexible, but like 20% or like 10% of your work time, you can use it like, okay, you can do some courses, you can do open source, work on something that's related to work, but not work itself. But if it's for you more on a like project base, like, hey, this has to be done. Let's see, okay, we want to have like some open source components, or like, okay, we want to use something. Oh, I use a package. Oh, it doesn't work. Then I quickly just do the PR to fix it if possible. Then I think that's a much better, like more flexible and dynamic system for sure.
And I know that every time we're like building like a new component, like not like a React component or Vue component, there's just like a piece of code, we try to think like, hey, like if this like can stand as a library of its own, like, well, let's just make it open source for everyone to use. Like, for example, like we use like a Vite plugin to build our SDKs before shipping them to NPM. And so we build that Vite plugin like in-house, and like we open source it. So like anyone can build like a SDK with them like using Vite. And for example, like I do on my own like SDK like that I make as an individual outside of Prismic. I use this one that we made at Prismic. And that's something cool. Like anyone could use. I will send you the link if you want to check it out.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And there's also the spirit of open source. In the end, you have a few more eyes on it, maybe even some contributions, and it will help everybody using it. And how about open source sponsoring? Do you have like anything in place? Or like, okay, let's maybe sponsor the packages that you mentioned that maybe, I don't know, they don't have enough funding to exist?
I'd love for Prismic like to get like a share of our revenue to open source. That's something we've been discussing for a long time internally. Like two things, like we are all aligned like that's something we would be happy to do. We're just taking like a proper framework to make that happen. Because one thing that would be, well, has been said like to be important for us is like if we give back to open source, it has to represent our users. If like all our users are using like technology A, like we might favor that technology like when giving back. Well, that's something like nothing is set in stone, but like basically we're just trying to figure out like a framework to give that money as fairly as possible. And well, that's a long ongoing discussion we have on our end. But yeah, well, hopefully we'll get there one day.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I also think like lots of companies eventually do that, saying, hey, this is our stack, for example. Of course, for like a headless CMS might be a bit more tricky because it's not only your stack, it's the SDKs for the different frameworks. And also, as you said, your users as well. But in general, just like the first step is awareness, like, right, okay, we want to do that. That's even like where it's like, okay, there's an option to do that. And like, okay, you take action to, we want to do that. Let's find the best way. And that might take a bit longer, but then at least it's fair. And I think it's a lot of like, it's a good thing. A lot of companies should do it, of course, if possible, to just have an option to fund open source project that then can continue working, because, well, we've seen it in the past multiple times that with more funding issues like Log4j and whatnot could have been avoided. Luckily not that big in the JavaScript ecosystem, the Log4j issue, but there are countless more. Like Core.js, also a very, very typical thing, and so on, so on. So I'm happy to hear that this is, let's say, work in progress. And if there are any news, definitely keep us posted. As a DX engineer, you also mentioned that, of course, Prismic is not only available for Nuxt. So you mentioned Astro already and lots of other frameworks. So do you also regularly work with, let's say, something like Next.js, Angular, Svelte?
So, well, I'm thankful, like, at Prismic, I'm the Nuxt and DejaVue, like, in-house expert. My second colleague is React and Next.js expert. And like the two others are like also someone like from time to time working also on Svelte, which are like the core like free technologies we want to support at Prismic. Well, I'll say thankfully, but like it's not like it's like a pain to work on React, but it's not my cup of tea. But yeah, I don't get to work on React often, so that's well, that's cool. And like my colleague is doing the React part and I'm doing the Vue part. And we're both doing like everything like Node and like agnostic, of course. And Svelte from time to time.
Sweet. So you basically can stay in your like expertise area, and of course then like the general work you can share and like collaborate together with. And
but even that, like I'm happy to change like now and then to just like get another perspective. Like we get to work like from time to time on the Prismic product itself, which like has a lot of like backendy stuff and like stuff that like we don't use like a lot when you're working just with Nuxt and stuff like that. So it's cool like to just like take a step back, like work with like other kind of tools and like just like it kind of like resources you, like refills your creativity. So like when you get back to your main mission, like you're like full of ideas and like things like to improve.
Yeah, I think it makes, once again, a lot of sense giving, okay, if you're in your own bubble, of course you see what other people are doing there, but just seeing, okay, how other people with different frameworks would achieve things, or just saying, like, okay, let's take a look at some other technologies and get an inspiration there, or also just chatting with someone with different framework. To me, it always like it helps a lot. It adds a lot of benefits because, of course, everybody in the Vue Nuxt bubble says, "Hey, Vue, amazing, Nuxt, so cool." But just saying, okay, what can other technologies do that might be interesting to see in our ecosystem? Not saying we should copy that straight like one by one, but just saying, okay, why people pick these? Why people like JSX, for example, or why they dislike Vue components? And I think there are lots of valid points there. For example, people saying, oh yeah, I like JSX because like it's fully type safe, and Vue components, it's a bit trickier. And yeah, these are fair points. So it's really nice to have that kind of exchange. Okay, yeah, I think then we talked about so many things throughout, like from open source, how you got into that, the Nuxt team, your work, how open source works at your company. So maybe the last question, where can people follow you? Of course, it's once again all in the show notes and in the description, but still, it's always good to mention it because people listen like, yeah, that's it. I will type now.
Yeah, well, like the easiest way I like to get like to follow things I'm doing is to go to my website. So it's lucie.red, like the color, and Lucie with an E because I'm French. And yeah, well, you can get everything on my website, like get my Twitter, get things I've been up to, and yeah, learn more about me there.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for coming on that episode. It was really lovely to talk through like all these like big bandwidth of topics, and yeah, definitely keep us posted how things go with the like share to open source, with maybe new modules to develop, or other projects. And yeah, we're looking forward, of course, to have you on again. So thank you so much. And for you out there, if you want to check out the older episodes of DejaVue, we have lots of amazing other episodes. Maybe just start episode 1 because they're still, most of them are still relevant. Check there. Actually, they all are. So come on.
Let's go binge watch DejaVue.
Yes. It's like, I don't even want to know how many hours of content there are. Maybe if someone wants to calculate it, write it down in the comments, definitely get a big thumbs up. Nevertheless, maybe this is not the newest episodes, so check out the newer ones as well. And nevertheless, thanks for joining and stay tuned, and hope to see you all soon again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.